Hi guys, this is Rita here from Picked and Polished, where I love to help you create beautiful things for your home, to sell in your business, or to inspire in DIY workshops. And today I'm going to show you how to use a sticky vinyl stencil on wood. I have this little plain piece of wood here today with me, and we're going to be making a custom sign, and I'm going to show you how easy breezy this process is. So that if you ever want to make your own Cricut stencils or silhouette stencils with sticky vinyl, or you want to pick one up at the Altered Studio, I have them locally, and you want to do this yourself, you can totally do it with some of my simple tips and tricks, and I'll be diving into that next. Okay, so first we're going to start with our clean, dry board. I have a damp brush that I'm using. I'm using the Dixie Belle synthetic round brush, but you can use any craft brush or whatever you have on hand is fine. I always make sure my brush is damp, my board is clean, and I'm just going to go ahead and paint my surface. And then I'm using the Dixie Belle Chalk Mineral paints, and I like the Chalk Mineral paint because the coverage is great and it dries super quick. It also is great for stenciling, which is the next part of this tutorial, because it's a thicker consistency, and you'll have less bleed through and cleaner lines with your sticky vinyl stencils. Okay, so I have decided to just sort of cover my board, but not completely. So I like a little bit of the wood showing through, and then I've done the same thing on the edge. I just want to give you a quick tip. I love to use my hair dryer to dry the surface really quickly and easily. So next step, once you know your board is super duper dry and there's no more moisture in the paint, it's time for you to get stenciling. So I'm going to take my stencil, and this is made out of a 631 stencil vinyl. This is the backing. The black section is the actual stencil. I'm going to peel these layers apart to show you. This is the stencil part here. This is the backing, and this layer on top is the paper transfer tape that I like to use. I'll add the links to my Amazon shop in the description box below in case you're looking for these materials to use yourself. So the first thing I do is I just kind of rub it down and make sure all those little pieces that are loosey-goosey have a place to go. And the idea is that your transfer tape is going to transfer your stencil from the backing to the board. So the first job you want to do is to go ahead and just smooth it out and start peeling back your backing. And your first job is to get the backing off with no vinyl left on it. So I'm just going to take my fingers, and do you see how I'm pushing down a little bit here? So if I had something with smaller letters, if my vinyl, like if this little piece right here lifted up at all, let's imagine it's kind of lifting up on the backing and not sticking down. Let's say that was happening. All you're going to do is go down and rub it a little bit, and then put some pressure to it when you go to lift back. And it should come off really easily. You're just going to continue to press and pull slowly so that you leave all of the vinyl pieces on there on your stencil. See how that one's starting to come up a little bit? I'm just going to go back and push that down, and then yay, I've got my backing here with nothing on it, and that is step one. All right, so step two, I've got my sticky side and my transfer tape side. I'm going to go ahead and set it down on my board where I want it to go. If you're really particular and you want to make sure it's centered, you can go ahead and get your rulers out now. And I just take the very edge of my last letter, the very beginning of my first letter, and measure and make sure they're equidistant from the edges. So I can see that's a little bit off. I'm going to pull this down a little bit. And then I kind of look at where my board ends. I want to make sure there's no letters going over that edge at all, and nothing going over this edge. I'm going to pull this down just a little bit, and you can see that this is a sticky stencil, but it's not so sticky that it won't come back up. if I want it to. So as long as you don't push it down really hard, it'll lift back up and you can reposition it. So don't get in a panic if it's not where you want it. Just lift it back up carefully and you can reposition. Once you're like 100% sure that you've got it where you want it and it's where you want it to be, that's when you can go ahead and rub the stencil down. And I especially pay attention to those little pieces that might come up when I try to peel the transfer tape up. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and smooth that out, and I'm gonna take this corner here and just, again, the same thing, I'm gonna pull the backing off, all right? Just slowly pull this transfer, not the backing, sorry, I misspoke. The transfer tape is gonna come off. All right, so here we go. I'm just pulling it back, and as it's pulling back, if something pops up a little bit, I'm not gonna get in a panic. I'm just gonna kind of say, all right, I'll just push that back down with the tape. No big deal. And the smaller the letters are, you have to go a little bit slower. So the tinier the pieces are, the more careful you kind of have to be. So there's my transfer tape, and I'm just going to set that off to the side. And now, look at, I've got my welcome stencil already on my board and ready to go. So next up, I'm going to show you how to paint this and get it sealed so that you don't have to worry about too much bleed through or going back and doing too many touch-ups. Okay, so now I have my stencil down. I'm going to make sure that all of my little areas of my vinyl are well sealed with my finger. I'm just going to kind of slowly go around, okay? And then it's time to start applying the paint over these areas. And one of my best tips is to make sure that you're using very little paint with your stenciling. So oftentimes I use a craft brush and I make sure it is super dry. That is really important. So the size brush I use really depends on the size lettering, but this is a pretty good size to use. It's just like, you know, it's about the size of my pointer fingernail in width. So I'm going to go ahead and use this one. I make sure it's super dry. Be careful that if you wash off your brushes, sometimes that water drips onto the brush itself, and then you get a wet brush again, and then the paint is more likely to bleed. I highly recommend you use a chalk mineral based paint like Dixie Belle paint, or your preference of chalk mineral paint or chalk paint, because it's gonna have a thicker consistency, and it's going to be less likely to bleed. So you can see my brush is really, really dry right now. I don't have any water dripping from the top of my brush. I'm going to use Dixie Belle's Caviar. I keep this in little containers here. And at the Altered Studio in Bristol, New Hampshire, you can grab your sample sizes at our paint bar to go with your stencils. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you. See how little bit of paint I have on there? There's nothing dripping. And my rule is I usually wipe off the excess, and then my rule is if you can flick this and paint splatters across from you, you've got too much paint on your brush. So you guys, very little paint is so important. So I'm gonna go ahead and just dab and feather. I'm not gonna push down hard, I'm just gonna lightly kind of feather that on. If you want a distressed letter look, you can just kind of lightly go over, and you can leave some parts of the white showing. I just recommend that you hit all those key points of the letter so that the letter doesn't look like it's missing pieces, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead, and I've got my E done. I'm going to do my M. And again, I'm just kind of dabbing it on. I'm not pushing super hard, and then I'm feathering it into those spaces. Same thing here. I always, before I start to brush over the stencil, I tend to wipe off the excess on this black part, because then I know I definitely have tapped off some of the extra drippies or whatever. So if in case it's too thick, that will prevent that from happening. I'm going to go ahead and move that over here so you can see better. I'm going to go ahead and just lightly feather that on, and you see I don't have a bunch of paint on there. It's super light. You're better off doing 2 super light coats than doing 1 heavy coat. There you go. That is a little bit too thick. Do you see that right there? So I went a little bit too thick right there, but I can just even it out or dab it with a little cloth if I need to. I'm just gonna go ahead and continue on with this process. Go. Okay, so for me, it's really important that if I want to go over it again, I'm using a super light coat. If I see any areas that I feel like are missing and I want a super crisp line, I might go over these areas one more time with another light coat, but look how quickly you can add your second coat. I mean, it's super fast. And I tend to like a little bit of distressed looking on my letters, but for this tutorial, I'll just kind of show you the basics of it. So again, this is my second coat, all right, and it's very, very light. My first coat would have been fine, and typically you want to wait until your first coat dries to go over the lettering with your second coat of paint. Again, very little paint, you guys. It'll go a long way if you're using a chalk-based paint. And the coverage with the Dixie Belle is really, really good, so you don't have to use very much of it to get great coverage. I'm just going to go in. I mean, that's how quick my second coat was. I'm just kind of going back over and keeping my brush going up and down rather than pushing this way is important, because then it's not going to push the paint underneath that stencil, the sticky part of the stencil. So then all I have to do now, let me just turn this around so you can see. All I have to do now is wait for that to dry, and then I can go ahead and peel the stencil off. All right, so now that my paint is dry, I can go ahead and pull my stencil off, and then I'll pull out those little pieces of the O, the E, the L. So I'm just gonna carefully pull from the side. This is the fun part, you guys. This is the big reveal. Look how satisfying that is. All right, so here's what it looks like when I pull that vinyl off for the first time. And then you might be thinking, well, what's going on there? Well, now I'm just gonna go back and pull these little guys off of the board. Definitely want to wait for your paint to be kind of dry by this point, because otherwise you're going to smear the paint. See how easy that is? You can do so many fun things with this technique. You could blend colors. You can get more as creative as you want to get. I used black and white because I knew it would be easy for you guys to see. And then you could always embellish your sign with some distressing or some antiquing wax around the edge or some glaze all over. But when you go over this surface, you want to make sure that the paint is definitely dry so that you're not smearing it apart. So I hope this has been super fun for you, and I hope that it encourages you to do one of these DIY signs yourself. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I'm happy to help anytime. Thanks for watching, you guys. Bye.